Welcome to the lecture 22 of week 5. The topic for today's class is introducing syntax. So, I told you in the last class that we will be talking about syntax for next few classes, and when we wrapped up morphology we also gave you certain indication that how we are actually going through a transition from morphology to syntax. So, in today's class we will be talking about some black box inside our head, and we will basically start our class with this idea of black box, and we will go back to certain notions that we have already learned in the beginning part of the course. These are the notions related to knowledge of language. Then I will introduce you to some new concepts, the definition of sentence, proposition and utterance, and the difference between these three. We will talk about form and order. Then we will be talking about the idea of models and certain methods in syntax, and finally we will be talking about the idea of adequacies. So, beginning from the black box, I think the idea of black box came in some lecture previously, if you remember. So, let us assume that the linguistic system of the brain is like a black box. Why we are saying black box? Suppose we do not know what is there and we need to understand what is there, that is our job as linguist. So, what we can do is we can put certain things into one side of the black box and see what is coming out from the other side. So, it will actually be helpful for us. We can observe what is happening. If you know about the input and you also know about the output, then you can think about the process of what is happening inside the black box, and we can begin theorizing about what has to be inside the black box. So, please pay attention that I am using the term theorizing, because in syntax we are talking about the certain theories which are very crucial in the modern day linguistics. So, at some stage we can start making predictions. What kind of predictions? We can say that if x goes into the black box, y will come out, and if we can find certain generalizations wrong, it means that we need to change our theory. So, if you are all of us are familiar with the concept of falsification, which is important in science. So, it is the same idea that we are trying to adopt here. At this point, I will ask you to recall certain concepts that we have already discussed previously. For example, I am sure you remembered the first question which is there on the slide, what people already know and what they do, the difference between these two. So, when we talked about the idea of competence and performance, right. So, we began the course with this idea of knowledge of language. We said that it is our primary goal in linguistics to know about the knowledge of language. So, in the discussion of competence, we actually talked about the knowledge of language, and we also said that performance is related to the usage. So, what they are doing is related to performance, and what they already know is related to competence, right. So, the standard experimental task in syntax is to get judgments from native speakers about the sentences on their or sentences of their language. So, you already know what is what do I mean by judgments and what do I mean by judgments from native speakers, because you have already done some tasks, right. You already listed some questions which are ungrammatical in your language, and I also asked you to think about the idea of well formedness behind it. So, you know what do I mean here when I am saying that get judgments from native speakers, but it is very important for you to pay attention at this point, because these judgments are extremely important for us for syntactic theory. So, this is where we are beginning this entire discussion, right. So, please pay attention to the last point on the slide. By feeding test sentences to native speakers and obtaining their intuitive judgments, we can understand what is there inside the black box. So, we are talking about the ways in which we do work in the domain of syntax. So, we feed some test sentences, we create a list of sentences which is related to the purpose of our task, and then we try to give the sentences to the native speakers. We get their intuitive judgments, and the judgments can help us to understand what is there inside the black box. So, we already know about certain concepts from our general understanding. So, we know that we have to consider the reliability of the data. So, I am going back to the distinction between grammaticality and acceptability, if you remember. So, we did say that the notion of grammaticality is not enough, but we also need the notion of acceptability. So, we are coming back to these two notions which will be super useful for us, and I am asking you to think about the source of the grammaticality judgments again. So, we know that our brain has a system for analyzing sentences. I hope you remembered the innateness hypothesis. Let us now talk about the distinction between sentence, proposition and utterance. So, maybe these terms are somehow familiar. For some of you, you already know these, know about the distinction of these three terms, but for some of you these are new. So, when we talk about proposition, we basically talk from a semantic point of view. So, we say we define proposition in the following manner. If you have some exposure to say logic, you are familiar with this notion already. A proposition is a statement which is either true or false. So, we are commenting on the status of proposition from a semantic point of view. On the other hand, the terms utterance and sentence are primarily used in syntax. The idea of sentence as an abstraction over utterances which have the same form as the second bullet point says. So, it is important for us to understand that when we talk about proposition, we talk about the meaning component. Proposition deals with the aspect of meaning of a sentence, but when we talk about sentence and utterance, we can say that an utterance is the actual use of a sentence. So, it means that sentence is not the not something that you are using, but utterance is something that you are using, right. It is very important for us to understand the distinction. So, our knowledge of language helps us to construct sentences, or you can say generate sentences. You are already familiar with this idea, and an utterance is something that we can hear, record or feed into a computer as a sound wave, but a sentence cannot be heard, recorded or manipulated. The use of sentences can. So, it means we are again going back to some kind of abstract notion. If you remember, in phonology we did talk about some abstract notion, in morphology we did talk about some abstract notion, again in syntax we are talking about some abstract notion, right. We can define sentences as the following way. Sentences are internal mental entities which are abstract. So, I am sure you understood when I am saying internal and mental entities, what do I mean, because we are talking about the related concepts for quite some time. But we have to keep in mind that when we say sentence, we are always talking about some abstract idea. This is the first important golden rule for doing syntax. Let us also talk about the idea of form and order, which are very important in syntax. It is also important for some other purpose that we will see later. So, what do I mean by order? So, you are already familiar with this idea of order for some other reason, right. The order of words are relevant to the meaning conveyed by a sentence. If you cannot have random orders, we have to follow certain rules. We did talk about orders while talking about rules, right. So, the following two sentences have the same words, but the meanings are different. You can say the cat is eating a fish and the fish is eating a cat. It is not the same, right. You are using the same set of words, but these have different meanings. So, the forms of a words in a sentence has certain relationship. So, if you remember the term word form, I think it does ring a bell. So, you remember this term. So, when we are saying that the forms of a words in a sentence has certain relationship, let us also try to understand it with an example. If I say the monkey is eating a banana and the monkey are eating a banana, there is a difference, right? So, what is the difference? The second one is ungrammatical, you can understand. So, there is some mismatch, some kind of mismatch. So, what do I mean by mismatch? There you can say that there is a problem of agreement. So, for some of you the term agreement is known. It means certain kind of relationship between words and phrases. We will come back to agreement again. So, if a native speaker is listening to these sentences, or someone who maybe somebody who has the native speaker's competence, a native speaker knows that the right order of words and the right systems of agreement are useful for constructing a sentence, right. You have this intuitive judgment that this is a right word order, that is a wrong word order. You also have the intuitive judgment that the system of agreement is okay for A and system of agreement is not okay for B. There is some problem. So, the native speakers can also comment on the ungrammaticality and unacceptability. You already know about these notions, and we will come back to it again and again. For some of you, the term cognitive science is well known, because this is basically a cover term for a group of disciplines, and many of you who are attending this course are, I am assuming that you are coming from different branches of cognitive science, if you are not coming from a linguistics background. So, let us also quickly talk about the role of syntax in the domain of cognitive science. So, as I told you, this is a covert term for a group of disciplines, and in all the disciplines of cognitive science, we do talk about the human being's ability to think. We did mention cognitive science in the beginning part when we were discussing Steven Pinker, if you remember. So, human beings are different from animals, even the smartest animals like the chimps. We already talked about certain experiments done by American psychologists, and we did talk about the fact that there is something which is very different in the human beings. So, what is the difference? We did talk about, if you remember, we did talk about the fact that human beings can create productive language, and human beings can also create combinatorial language. So, you can say that this is productive and combinatory. These two features are making human language very special and also creating a difference between human and animal communication. So, language helps us to talk about abstract thought process, because we are also dealing with several abstract notions according to different levels, while we trying to talk about the theories of language. So, language helps us to talk about abstract thought process as well, and we should know that syntax plays a major role here. So, now the question is, how do we model syntax? So, you already know the name of Chomsky. We have been talking about his work for several classes, and you know that the first book by Chomsky was out in 1957, Syntactic Structures, if you remember. So, Chomsky's theories are here from since the 1950s, but it has different names through its development. So, Chomsky is basically revising his theories and creating different ideas. So, it has different names. Some of you are familiar with this name or term, transformational generative grammar. Then there is the standard theory, extended standard theory, government and binding theory, principles and parameters approach, which we have mentioned previously, and something called minimalism, which is fairly new. So, coming back to the term generative, if you remember, we did talk about the idea that sentences are generated by a subconscious set of procedures, and it's very much like computer programs. So, the generation is important for our purpose, and these procedures are part of our mind. So, if you remember, we did talk about different abilities, right. So, there are certain procedures which are specifically important for language, there are certain procedures which are overlapping with language, but they have other roles to play, etc. So, when we are saying that these procedures are part of our mind, we are indicating the various cognitive abilities. And we can say now, which is very important, syntactic theory aims to model these procedures. So, if you ask what is the role of syntactic theory, why do we do syntactic theory and why it is very important in contemporary linguistics, you can say that syntactic theory aims to model these procedures, which are basically the subconscious set of procedures, and we are talking about the generation of sentences. So, what do I mean by modeling? So, you can say that modeling these procedures is a set of formal rules. So, you know what do we mean by rules by now, and why rules play a major role in linguistics, and you have understood that these are not related to the rules of grammar that we learn in school, right. So, if you focus on the methods in syntax, you can say that how do we conduct data analysis in syntax. You can say that initially we gather data from any language which is our target, then we observe them, generalize and test them against the hypothesis. So, we can basically term the hypothesis as a rule. So, whatever we are hypothesizing based on the data that we have from any language which is our domain of expertise, or we are trying to work on the language. So, you can say that the hypothesis that you are creating after observation, these can be termed as the rules. This is very important. And a group of hypotheses that can describe the syntax of a language is basically the grammar of a language. So, it's a very different idea of grammar. If you remember the idea of universal grammar, we also had a very different approach towards grammar, right. I mean, it's not school grammar, it's very different, you have understood by now. So, please pay attention to the fact that how we are defining a grammar here. We are saying that a group of hypotheses that we are creating based on the data and the generalization is basically creating the grammar of a language. So, now let me introduce you to a basic problem that you have to solve by yourself. So, let me read it out. There is a new term called anaphora. So, what is this? If you think about pronouns like himself, herself, so let us term them as anaphora. And so, we can say that there is a concept of anaphor or anaphora here in this data, and there is another term called antecedent. What does it mean, antecedent? So, if I say something like he likes himself, he is the antecedent of the anaphor himself. So, we have, suppose we have got this generalization that an anaphor must agree in person, gender and number with its antecedent. So, the terms person, gender and number are familiar from school grammar to us. So, when we are saying agree, it means it has a direct relationship. We got this term agreement earlier in today's class. It means there is some kind of relationship between the words in a sentence. So, there should be some relationship between he and himself in the sentence he likes himself, and the relationship should be defined in terms of person, number and gender. So, this is the generalization, suppose. So, before I introduce you to the data, there is one more bullet point. So, however, there is much more to say about the distribution of these nouns. Consider the data below. I am asking you to make an addition to the above statement that explains the distribution of anaphor and antecedents. So, let us read the sentences. Ram sang to himself, himself sang to Ram, which is wrong, ungrammatical. Nita loves herself in blue leather shows herself that Nita is pretty. So, there are two ungrammatical and two grammatical sentences, and it is your call to figure out what is happening in this data, the problem set. So, now if you look at the sentences E and F, everyone should be able to defend himself, herself, themselves, or I hope nobody will hurt themselves or himself or herself. So, is it the case that the sentences follow the generalization that you have just made? If yes, why? If no, why not? So, if there is something special about the antecedents, if there is some exception, or if you can modify the generalizations to fit these cases. So, this is a task for yourself that you are supposed to do. Here we are basically trying to generalize certain things. We have already created a hypothesis. We are trying to test the hypothesis against some data. So, we already learnt about rules, right. So, we knew that the rules tell us the order to put our words when we talked about the concept of form and orders. So, for example, do we use the verb before the subject or the subject before the verb? It depends on the language, right. It is the basic word order of different languages. So, you can if you pay attention to the rule of a language, you can figure out where the subject and verb are located in a sentence. So, the rules generate the sentences of a language. This is very important. We already know about the idea of generation, but the rules are generating the sentences of a language. We are again highlighting this part. And where do rules come from? We are already familiar with this idea. We are just trying to brush up certain concepts that we have discussed previously. We know that language is acquired as opposed to learnt. We did discuss about the difference between learning and acquisition, if you remember. And we know that our knowledge of language is subconscious, it is innate, and the human facility for language, or the term that we used in this class, the language organ, we can term it as the universal grammar. And when we are saying that language is acquired, we actually mean that the rules of language are acquired, right. But there is a debate regarding this issue. So, it was also pointed out by a person called Alec Marantz. So, infinite systems are unlearnable and unacquirable. So, if we say that we have an infinite system in inside our head, so it means that it is not everything is acquired, there is something which is built in. So, this is another logic for discussing the idea of infinite system, learnability, language acquisition, and the language organ. We know that language is a productive system. If you remember the very long sentences that we discussed previously, and we said that recursion is a major feature of language. So, recursion is basically some kind of embedding, right. We are embedding more components in a sentence. So, because language is a productive system, we can create very long sentences and continue like building sentences, more long sentences. So, I also hope that you remember the logical problem of language acquisition that we have discussed. This will be useful again for our present purpose. And we did say that language is structure dependent. And for example, if you think about any structural property like say yes no questions. So, the questions where the answer is either yes or no. Suppose you are saying the man is here, you can say is the man here, the answer will be either yes or no. So, all the languages have yes no questions. This is a structure dependence, this is an example of structure dependence. So, now let us talk about the concept of adequacy and levels of adequacy, which is a new concept for us. So, we have been talking about some hypothesis, which is basically the rule of language. So, how do we know that one hypothesis is basically a good hypothesis and another hypothesis is a bad hypothesis? So, we can evaluate them on the basis of this notion of adequacy. So, we say that a grammar can attain 3 stages of adequacy. So, if you in your theory you account for only data, it is observationally adequate grammar. If your theory incorporates data and the native speaker's judgment related to the well formedness, then you can term the grammar as a descriptively adequate grammar. In addition to this, if you also account for how children acquire language, so you can say that it is explanatorily adequate grammar. It is very important for you to pay attention to the differences between these 3 grammars: observationally adequate, descriptively adequate and explanatorily adequate. And this is basically, these 3 levels will be helpful for us in future as well. You already learnt about the difference between prescriptive and descriptive grammar, if you remember. So, how can we create the difference between them? So, we can say that the grammar rules as taught by the so called language experts, so these are inaccurate descriptively, rather they prescribe how people should talk or write rather than describe how they speak. So, most of our school grammars are like prescriptive grammars, right. But now after learning the concepts of adequacy, you can look at or read the definition of descriptive grammar through a new lens. So, what is a descriptive grammar? A scientific grammar that describes rather than prescribes how people talk or write. So, you are basically talking about what people are doing rather than saying that what people should do, right. So, at this point let me also tell you that there are alternative theories of generative grammar, and if you are interested in these theories you can go through the references. So, there is something called head driven phrase structure grammar, lexical functional grammar, construction grammar, autolexical syntax, role and reference grammar, and all these different theories of generative grammar are used for different purposes and adopted by groups of people for research and analysis. But we are focusing on Chomskyan system of grammar, and we shall be talking about the models in Chomskyan theory. So, we already talked about the principles and parameters approach. So, here we will be primarily talking about the government and binding theory briefly. We will not go into the detail of government and binding theory. We will be just pointing out to the basic ideas of it and also introduce certain ideas from minimalism, which is a newer theory given by Chomsky. So, coming to the conclusion, what we did in today's class, we did talk about the black box, the concept of black box and our hypothesis, how we basically rely on the input and output to hypothesize. Then we talked about the methods of doing syntax, how we feed test sentences to and also get native speakers' judgments to construct our theories. We talked about the ideas of proposition, utterance and sentence. We did say that proposition is related to semantic concept, and sentences and utterances are basically syntactic. So, you can say utterances are actual use of the abstract sentences. We also talked about the orders and form of words which are important for syntactic analysis. We did say that a set of formal rules, which we can say that it is a grammar of a language, can help us to create models. and then there are 3 levels of adequacies which will be helpful for us. We talked about different models in syntax and said that we shall be using a particular model. So, I hope it was the basic ideas behind syntax was useful. These are the key references. Thank you.